I've heard several fellow AP Art history teachers puzzle over why the College Board included no works of art from the Minoan or Mycenaean civilization and 3 works from the Etruscan civilization, really 4 if we count the statue of Apollo and the Temple of Veii as separate works. Well, it was the Etruscans who taught the Romans to divine the future and the mysterious will of the gods by looking at the entrails, or guts, of disemboweled sacrificial animals. Since I don't plan to become an augur, I won't try to fathom the mysteries of the College Board's thinking. And anyway, I don't mind. Etruscan art is fascinating and deserves a day of our time. Someday, when you travel to Rome, you should check out the Etruscan Museum. It's a favorite. Of course, I have a lot of favorites in Rome. The mural you see here, by the way, is from the so-called Tomb of the Augurs, and it illustrates these rather gory rituals. Julius Caesar, along with many other Romans, was a big believer in reading entrails, that is, guts, to foresee the future. Let's watch a brief video clip to get an introduction to the Etruscans. Here's a map that shows ancient Etruria, which was centered in the northern Italian region that today we call Tuscany, after the Etruscans. The height of Etruscan culture was approximately 800 to 500 BCE, that is, the same period as the Archaic period in Greece. Like the Greeks, the Etruscans lived in city-states that often fought each other, a major reason why the Romans were able to throw off their Etruscan king in 509 and decisively conquer the Etruscans in the centuries after that. But the Roman conquest poses serious problems for understanding the Etruscan culture. We have only a few fragments of Etruscan writing, and the language remains largely undeciphered by linguists. So, we have to rely on the Greeks and Romans to tell us about the Etruscans. And as you've just heard, a lot of what they had to say was not flattering. But the Romans probably admired the Etruscans more than they let on. Roman religion, engineering, and architecture in particular owe a lot to the Etruscans. The video mentioned that much of the Etruscan wealth came from metalworking. Here are some really superb examples. None of them required works. Much of what we do know about the Etruscans we've learned from their tombs. The Etruscans buried their dead, or at least their wealthy dead, in elaborate, partly sunken round tombs called tumuli. A large concentration of these tumuli outside the major cities was called a necropolis, or a city of the dead. As you can sort of see from the photo on the bottom right, these cities of the dead were indeed laid out as cities, with rows of what looked like streets. The tombs themselves resembled houses for the living. They had beds, armchairs, drinking cups, pitchers, knives, even stone pillows. Let's watch just the first minute or so of a virtual tour of this tomb. And now we come to the first of our required works, the tomb of the Triclinium, discovered in the necropolis of Monterozzi near Tarquinia. The tomb consists of a single room. The fresco on the back wall shows a banquet with diners resting on 3 clinae, or couches. Triclinium simply means 3 couches. It's a little hard to see, but under the couches a cat is, maybe, stalking a rooster and a partridge. Art historians believe that Etruscan murals were heavily influenced by the banquet scenes that were popular on red figure Greek pottery. This Greek red figure crater was made half a century after the tomb, but you can see important stylistic similarities. So what are some of these? Well, the pose is very similar, with faces in profile with a frontal eye and the bodies turned in a 3/4 view. We have some sense of movement and interaction, but the poses are still quite stylized. What big differences do you notice? Well, in the Greek banquet scene, the only woman is there to entertain the male diners. In the Etruscan funerary banquet, a man and a woman are dining together. How can we tell that we're seeing a man and a woman? It was a convention of Etruscan art, like Minoan art, to depict women with much lighter skin than men. On the left wall, we see 3 female dancers, 1 male dancer, and a male musician, placed between small trees filled with birds. So let's pause for a comparative moment. Here we have essentially 2 tomb paintings, although the Etruscan painting is a wall fresco and the Egyptian Book of the Dead is painted on a papyrus scroll. Still, both cultures believed strongly in an afterlife and buried their dead with all the comforts that they would need in their next home to take to their next home. So what sets the Etruscans apart from the Egyptians? The Egyptian painting is highly moralistic. A good life after death must be earned. We don't really see this element in the Etruscan painting, yet both paintings are clearly a celebration of the life and status of the deceased. The banquets and games that accompanied Etruscan funerals showcased the family's social status, while sending the deceased off with food, drink, and utensils to keep partying in the afterlife. Still, it's hard not to conclude that the Etruscans expected to have more fun in the hereafter than the Egyptians did, and maybe they were a little less likely to cast judgment on a person's behavior on Earth as well. It's hard not to think the same is true of our devoted couple. The work strongly suggests that they genuinely enjoyed each other and expected to continue enjoying each other in the afterlife. Note that this is an additive sculpture made of clay, not stone. Terracotta has some important advantages over stone. It was easier to mold clay than to carve stone to create a smooth surface for applying paint. Also, the Etruscans did not have the same access to marble and other stones that the Greeks and Romans had. You caught the information that this would have been fired in segments and then united, right? I think we're naturally drawn to this couple and what seems to be their obvious enjoyment of one another. But is this truly a naturalistic work? We don't really know what the couple looked like, but this appears to be quite stylized. The man and woman have very similar facial features, including almond-shaped eyes, arched eyebrows, and of course that archaic smile. Their positioning, while affectionate, is quite unnatural. No one could bend at the waist like that with legs outstretched, at least not, and smile at the same time. The fingers and toes are too long and narrow. Still, there's no getting around the animation that the figures convey, even at rest, even after death. Here's further evidence that the work is highly stylized. This is another sarcophagus of the spouses, this one in the Louvre Museum in Paris. Notice how similar the facial features in the two sarcophagi are, especially the men's. I could imagine this work's an attribution question, by the way. Here are some comments from the Louvre website that would apply to both works. The couple are reclining on cushions in the form of wineskins, a reference to the sharing of wine, a ceremony that was part of the funerary ritual. The deceased woman is pouring a few drops of perfume into her husband's hand, another essential component of funerary ritual. In her left hand, she is holding a small, round object, possibly a pomegranate, a symbol of immortality. Moving along to the temple of Minerva at Veii, here are two of our three required images. The third is the statue of Apollo. And here I've given you a labeled floor plan with some useful art history vocabulary, and a side as well as a frontal elevation. There's a reason that most of the Etruscan art that has survived was found in tombs. The protected environment helped keep the frescoes and terracotta from deteriorating. Etruscan temples were made mostly of mud brick or volcanic stone and wood. They were not as lucky. So what we know of these temples, we know mostly from later Greek and Roman writers, especially Vitruvius. The Etruscan cella is divided into three parts. Scholars think this cella contained the three cult statues for Minerva, the Roman version of Athena, and also for Jupiter, Zeus, and Juno or Hera. The cella and indeed the temple are also closed off in the back, whereas in Greek temples the cella and cult statue were designed to be approached from all sides. Finally, one ascended to this temple. It is much higher off the ground than a Greek temple, with its relatively low stylobate or temple floor. This high floor is referred to usually as a podium. One reason for the higher entryway may be location. Where did the Greeks tend to build their temples? On top of high hills, right? The Etruscans and the Romans after them built their temples down in the fora, or urban centers, like the Greek agora. So to raise the temple above the city and toward the heavens, the temple had to be put onto a higher platform. How do Tuscan columns differ from Greek Doric columns? They have bases which most, though not all, Doric columns do not, and they have no fluting. They were also made of wood rather than stone. And of course, the Greeks tended to put their sculptures into friezes, whereas the Etruscans placed terracotta sculptures rather oddly on their roofs. When it comes to function, however, the Greeks, Etruscans, and later the Romans tended to use their temples in much the same way. In other words, they had similar functions. They housed cult statues of the gods. The temple building was only one part of the templum, that is, the defined sacred space that included the building, altar, and other sacred grounds. In all three cultures, Greek, Etruscan, and Roman, the altar used for sacrifice and ritual ceremonies was located outside the temple. I've mentioned that Etruscan ceremonies focused heavily on the ceremonial slaughtering of animals and subsequent interpretations of their innards. This was an important element in Roman temple worship as well. The Etruscans may have picked this up from their trade ties with the ancient Near East. We have historical records of the Babylonians performing fairly similar rituals. And the Greeks did the same, but they were not as obsessed with livers as the Etruscans or the Romans. Only a few of these rooftop terracotta sculptures have survived. This one is probably the most famous, and it's another of your required works. Some art historians, and apparently the College Board, believe that Vulca of Veii was the sculptor, but there's some controversy over that. At any rate, he is associated with the workshop that produced the terracotta sculpture, and we know about him from the Roman writer Pliny, who tells us that in the late 6th century BCE, an Etruscan artist named Vulca was summoned from Veii to Rome to decorate the most important temple there, the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Here we see the Apollo next to the archaic Anavisos Kouros. What is the main difference that you notice? Our Etruscan god is on the move. He uses negative space in a way that we won't see in Greek sculpture for a few more decades. He is also gazing more directly at Hercules, not just out into a generalized space. The face still wears the goofy archaic smile, but our Khan Academy historians think it is a more animated, engaging version. And of course, this Apollo keeps his clothes on. Okay, now we get a little ahead of ourselves. The College Board has used this image a lot in the past, but it's no longer on the list. Still, the Maison Carée is probably the best preserved Roman temple that we have, and it's based on a temple that Emperor Augustus built in Rome that no longer survives. Augustus, as we'll soon learn, was a huge fan of Greek art, and he deliberately set out to evoke the golden age of Pericles. So what Greek elements do you see here? There's a clear pediment, and the columns are in the Corinthian style that the Romans tended to favor. But Roman temples also borrowed many features from the Etruscans. What do you see here? The temple has a pseudo-peripteral facade. That means it has Greek-style freestanding columns in front and engaged columns, that is, columns that are attached to the wall on the back and sides. Similarly, we see the deep front porch and much higher platform. Again, this was built in a forum, not on a necropolis. Here are photos of the three temples. The Etruscan temple is, of course, a model based on Vitruvius's descriptions, not a real temple. And here we see the three floor plans. This is a question that appeared on the 2007 AP Art History exam, that is the old curriculum. Since Maison Carée is not a required work, you would not get this precise question, although I still think you might be given this image and asked to identify the Etruscan and Greek elements of this or a similar Roman temple. So, if you have a few minutes left, why don't you brainstorm together about how you would answer this question? Here are the 2007 scoring guidelines for this question. How many of these did you get? And suppose you got this question, which I just made up. How would you answer? Both temples are placed on a podium or platform instead of a low stylobate. Both have a front porch or pronaos. Both have a triangular area above the entablature, although in the Etruscan temple it is open and not filled with sculpture. And for differences, the Maison Carée has Corinthian columns topped with acanthus leaves, while the Etruscan temple employed Tuscan columns with a base and no fluting. It's a little hard to see from this photo, but the Maison Carée columns are in fact fluted. The Roman temple has engaged columns on the sides. The Etruscan walls beyond the portico or porch are flat. The Roman temple has a filled-in pediment, although it does not include sculpture. The Etruscan pediment's shape is open. And of course, the Etruscans have all those statues milling about on the roof. And that, alas, is all the time we have to give to the Etruscans. On to